Even though I have the title of Director of Sound Design, it's not a job that requires me to do much managing. I still get to work on movies, and so about 95% of my time is spent working on films, working on the sound for films. And I'm still passionate about it because I still find it fun and interesting, and I feel like I'm just now beginning to get good at what I do after having done it for about 30 years. And so I'm enjoying the fact that I'm a little bit better at it than I used to be, and still discovering things. When I was a child, I did spend a lot of time in the forest. We lived in two different places that were out in the middle of nowhere in a forest. And there weren't many other children in the area, and so I spent a lot of time by myself wandering around these forests during the day, especially in the summer. And so I think one of the reasons that I have an affinity for sound is that I would spend a lot of time in the forest listening, and I would hear little creatures off in the distance, and insects, and the sound of the wind in the leaves, and that had a profound effect on me. So even though I don't have recordings of things from early in my life, I think I have a mental recording of some of those sounds that sometimes guide me a bit. Well, I think that the most interesting parts of most works of art come from happy accidents, and you have to make lots of not so happy accidents to build up a few happy ones. And that's the main reason why it's a good thing to have more time to work on a project. When you've been doing sound work as long as I have, when a producer hires you, they think, well, we're hiring Randy Thom because he already knows how to do what it is that we want him to do. And though I certainly know a lot of technique in terms of sound, I never know exactly how I'm going to accomplish any new project that I work on. And so I have to do a lot of experimenting with every project, just like a new person would need to. And so I count on those happy accidents and know that I'll have to make lots of mistakes and go down dead ends and before I discover things that work well. Well, there aren't as many differences in the sound effects for an animated film relative to a live action film as you might think. Partly because directors of contemporary animated films usually want their animated films to sound like live action films. Often one of the first things an animation director will tell me is, I don't want it to sound like a cartoon. I want it to sound like a real film or a live action film. And so the kinds of sounds that I develop with our team for an animated film are usually very much the same kinds of sounds that we would develop for a live action film. And many of the live action films that we work on have so much CG in them that they might as well be animated anyway. You have to, when I'm working on one of those films, we have to invent the whole sonic universe anyway, which is what you need to do in an animated film also. So the work on dialogue is very different on an animated film than it is on a live action film, but the work on the sound effects tends to be pretty similar. Certain kinds of sounds, whether you're working with a robot or a live creature for a film, are fairly easy to do. It's fairly easy to invent or to come up with a scary sound, for instance. It's much more difficult with a robot or a dragon, for instance, to come up with a sound that is sympathetic, that makes the character seem lovable, or to make you feel sorry for the character. And for those kinds of sounds, we often wind up having to use human vocalizations of some kind. So if it's a dragon, for instance, or a dinosaur, and the character is angry and vicious in one moment, but then gets hurt, and you need to feel sorry for them in the next moment, then what we do is try to gracefully make a sound transition from a recording of a tiger or something like that that was appropriate for a vicious character to a human vocalization that will elicit a feeling of sympathy. And there are various tricks that we use to do that. One is to manipulate the pitch of maybe both the end of the tiger sound and the beginning of the human sound so that they match each other better. I might start the human vocalization that I'm using for the dragon with a kind of guttural, sound like that, and then make a transition into a more sympathetic or lovable sound. But the gravelly or more animalistic beginning of the sound will better match the end of the tiger recording that I used in the previous moment for the same character. Yeah, I have a studio at Skywalker, and I have a studio at home that's connected to Skywalker through a link. And certainly Pro Tools is the main tool that I use, and SoundMiner is the library search engine that we use at Skywalker. And I have a high quality portable recording setup and with Shep's microphones. And I've always used MS, at least since the first few years I started doing recording, partly because in the early years it was easier to get an MS set up inside one Zeppelin. And if you're jumping on trains and jumping off trains, the smaller equipment package you have, the better. So that was useful to me. And very often I find with MS that if I just lay down the M on one channel and the S on the other, I may decide in the end not to combine them at all, because it may be that the M recording is closer and that's more useful, or the S picks up more of the ambient sound and that's more useful, or maybe if a loud sound happens, the M channel will be distorted because it's pointed at the sound, and the S channel won't, so that'll save me. I'll be able to use the recording even though one channel is distorted. And in some cases I do combine the two to make a stereo recording, but I like the fact that the MS is versatile in that way. I probably pitch change sounds more than I do any other technical operation with sounds. You pitch something down to make it sound bigger, more impressive. As I said, I'm often pitch changing the beginning or the end of a sound to better match what comes before it or after it. And I do a lot of volume graph manipulation in Pro Tools. And by the way, I actually do most of my mixing with a mouse in Pro Tools. I'm not as in love with moving faders up and down as most mixers are. And very often I'll mix a sequence without even looking at the picture for a while. I'll mix it as if it were a radio play, just listening to the sounds. And then after I get a mix that I think is pretty good, I'll look at it and listen to it with the picture, and then that'll suggest changes that I should make to it. But you can also, just in terms of manipulating individual sounds, I find that often I can do interesting things with quickly spaced volume variations to give the sound a kind of texture that it wouldn't have otherwise. As of today, as we speak in 2011, real-world sounds that have been recorded with a microphone are usually better storytelling tools than electronically synthesized sounds. Some sound designers think that the essence of sound design is to come up with some strange sound that nobody's ever heard before. And certainly for some kinds of films that's useful, but when people send me their reels, and I get quite a few sound design reels, as you can imagine, they often seem to think that the stranger the sound is, the more successful they've been as a sound designer, and I don't think that that's true at all. The way to impress me as a sound designer is to do a creature vocalization, which I think is the most difficult kind of sound design to do. I think I don't have any doubt that someday we will be able to electronically synthesize any sound that we want. We can make it sound natural if we want it to sound natural, or unnatural if we don't want it to. But we're not there yet with the technology. And I can usually tell when sounds have been electronically generated, and for me it's often distracting or inappropriate. Yeah, very often the quiet scenes are more difficult to do than the loud scenes, but loud scenes that involve lots and lots of elements are difficult to deal with also. It's very tough to make an action sequence where you have gunshots and explosions and breaking glass and things flying through the air and people screaming and musical score. To make sense of all that, to make it coherent, is a very tough job. And so I have a lot of respect for anybody who can do that. And it almost always involves knowing what sounds you can get rid of or attenuate, and which sounds you need to emphasize. Because if you just play all of the sounds at equal volume, it'll just be noise and will be minimally interesting or useful, I think. I don't have anything against a film being loud for a moment or two or a short period of time. I think that's completely appropriate in a given story. But I do have a big problem with a film that is loud continuously for 20 or 30 minutes. I think that's just bad film design. And it's a problem with the way the film has been written or directed. I think even in an intense action sequence, it's a much more interesting sequence if you can find a way to get the characters into a relatively quiet place for a moment or two. And so then when they go back out into the loud, action-filled landscape, it seems even louder because you're comparing it to the quiet place. But if you have a sequence that's loud for 20 or 30 minutes, you've forgotten what it's like to be quiet, and so nothing really seems loud because everything is loud. 3D is not affecting the sound for films as much as you might think, and that's partly because sound has been 3D for 50 years. We've had surround sound of one kind or another, one format or another in film for a very long time, since as early as the 1940s. And though it wasn't very widespread at that point. And so we've been able to move sounds around in a 3D space for a long time. Now we have a couple of new release formats, 7.1, and people are working on additional speaker channels for movie theaters. And those certainly help us a little bit to do something new with the 3D space. But I think this is one of those areas where sound was more advanced than the visuals, and the visuals are now finally catching up to where sound was 20 or 30 years ago. I'm certainly open always to listening to and experimenting with new technologies. I never want technology to be the main thing that we think about in sound. As a sound designer, you're really mostly an artist, you're not an engineer, and all advances don't have to center around some new technology. I think the most important advances that need to be made in sound are about communicating with directors and being involved early and contributing ideas that will help tell the story, and those don't necessarily have anything to do with technology. On the other hand, it's certainly true that advances in technology allow us to do some things that we couldn't before, and so I think it's important to be aware of what's out there. I've heard isono, and I think that at least for certain kinds of projects, it can be a very useful storytelling tool to have all of those channels. And I think there are bound to be other similar developments coming in the next few years, and I'll be curious to see what they are.